As gas prices and inflation climb to record highs and America starts to lose its standing in the world, Trump drops the first batch of the UFO files to distract from the war that was supposed to distract from the Epstein files. This week, we'll begin to explore the highly anticipated UFO files, including the existence of Nazi UFOs and potentially alien-surveilled Apollo missions. We'll also talk about the influence of the study group, or mega group, a circle of wealthy Israeli entrepreneurs founded by Les Wexner, one of the closest men to Jeffrey Epstein. Follow the show on TikTok and Instagram and send a conspiracy theory you want to see discussed to info@jetfuelcan'tmeltsteelbeams.com. This is the Jet Fuel Can't Melt Steel Beams podcast, episode number 22.
This is the age of misinformation, get information. No homosexuals, Democrats, or immigrants in your nation. I gotta think about anything else. I try to cope, but it's bad for my health. I don't even think that anything helps. This is the most paranoid that I felt. This is the age of misinformation. How could you be?
All right, welcome back to the podcast, folks. So today we're obviously talking about the UFO files. So last Friday, May 8th, 2026, Trump dropped what is being referred to as the first batch of the UFO files. And you can actually go to it yourself by just typing in war.gov/UFO. I want to give you guys a general overview of how the public has been receiving the UFO files, along with a few things that I found in there myself. Since they came out last Friday, I've been able to go through about a quarter of the files myself. And I got to tell you, so far, it's not been too revelatory. It's definitely not the terrifyingly singular disclosure that everyone was hoping for. And there's definitely no smoking gun that proves that aliens or extraterrestrial spaceships exist. Yes, some stuff remains a mystery, but again, there's no smoking gun, and there's definitely no hard evidence minus some grainy photos. Nothing you couldn't have gleaned off of some popular books on the subject matter. And I only got a quarter of the way through because there's nearly 170 documents. And while some of them are just like one photo long or one testimony long, a lot of them are at least 200 pages long. And it's across different departments like the Department of War, the Department of State, NASA, and the FBI. But overall, the first batch was a little bit underwhelming. And we do get emphasis that this is the first batch of UFO files. We should get another batch in a few weeks. And the first general thing I wanted to talk about was this aura of transparency. I heard this term first used on Tuesday's episode of Breaking Points, but it is popular in the 2020s especially to have this aura of transparency, where it looks like we're revealing stuff that's been kept secret for decades and decades, like the JFK assassination, the MLK Jr. assassination, Epstein, UFOs. But the way in which it's revealed is controlled for an ulterior motive and extremely incomplete and misleading. And this is in an era where institutional distrust is at an all-time high. So if you're going over all the materials at war.gov/UFO, you see a lot of mainly recycled videos, things that have made the rounds on the internet many times before. But there are also a few photos and a few videos that are new. And another claim being made by David Grush, who was at the forefront of this entire disclosure movement, is that the Trump administration is actually being blocked by other members of the intelligence community on aspects of this disclosure. Grush specifically points to the DIA and the CIA. And a few congressmen, some on both sides of the aisle, have come forward claiming, because they have higher access to all of this intelligence, especially regarding UFOs, claiming that this disclosure was barely anything at all, that barely anything has been released. It's kind of like the Epstein documents and the claim that there's at least 6 million Epstein documents out there, but we're only being shown about 2.5 million. The same goes for these UFO files. There are millions and millions of files out there, especially since the modern day UFO phenomenon started post-World War II. So that's 8 decades of space to take up there. It's easy to imagine that the information could fill up terabytes and terabytes of space. So the thing that's often the case with these disclosures is not necessarily what's being included in the disclosure, but A, what's not being included in the disclosure, and B, what are the reasons for picking the things that we do see. And throughout all of this, it continues to be the case that the public believes one thing and one thing above all else, that this is all a distraction from the government. My analysis, having again read through just a quarter of the material, focusing on the documents from the FBI and NASA first, I would say that these documents would be quite the shock to someone who has been a huge skeptic and has not absorbed a lot of information from the UFO community. If you are someone who is a skeptic without any information about UFOs historically, then the contents of this disclosure would seem pretty significant. Yes, you have all like these grainy photos and these really grainy videos, but you also have some transcripts that are quite haunting from NASA, talking about objects being seen during the Apollo missions. And actually you have some video and photographic evidence from the 2020s, even, that far recently, that are pretty hard to explain away as well. But other than that, it's pretty tame. I would say so far the most interesting parts are where we get to see the government and its various agencies' reaction to the UFO phenomenon, the logic that they use to grapple with it. But overall, and this is the point that I want to stress the most before really diving into the UFO files in any way, shape, or form, is that I think all of this fits perfectly with the government's strategy of pure confusion and flooding the zone. It would really take someone who's like an expert in the history of UFO disclosure to go through all these materials and sort of understand which materials are misleading, which ones are almost like red herrings, and which ones are talking about legitimate things. By including like a little bit of everything in these files, you're flooding the zone with information, and it's hard to get a consensus on what the files actually mean. Two examples are all the hoaxes mentioned, especially in the FBI files, and one example that I've been seeing on social media, which are references to the Majestic 12. There are plenty of documents in the FBI files that show interviews with people who saw UFOs and mentions of investigations that are interdepartmental. But the one thing that isn't clear unless you do like a separate Google search, or again, unless you're an expert in this field, most of the things that they're talking about are hoaxes. And that's fine at the end of the day because the information is readily available. But what that does do is make it extremely hard to parse through for someone, again, who has not been exposed to this information before. And so maybe you have a stack of information that's this tall, that's exploring all these hoaxes and really diving into things that we already have answers on, but are just historical proof of what the FBI did in response, or the Department of War, or the State Department. And then over here, maybe we have like the legitimate answer that points towards a phenomenon. And then I keep seeing all these references on social media to Majestic 12 documents, which was this purported secret committee of scientists, military leaders, government leaders that knew the truth about the UFO and alien phenomenon. And there were only 12 of these people, which hence the name Majestic 12. This committee would have supposedly been formed in 1947 under the guidance of Harry Truman, but through painstaking reporting, it's been pretty much proven that Majestic 12 is a complete hoax. So these references to the Majestic 12 are kept within the UFO files for historical reference, but the idea of the Majestic 12 is, again, a complete hoax, making it really hard to parse through these 170 entries, and again, some of these entries have like 200 pages each. But with even that in mind, what the government gives us here, again, is pretty underwhelming. So the files largely confirm an already established timeline. And personally, I think some of the best reporting on, this general timeline is by Garrett Graff in this book, UFO, The Inside Story of the U.S. Government's Search for Alien Life Here and Out There. But basically, modern UFO sightings largely begin during World War II with these Foo Fighters, which are these like glowing balls of light that are in the sky that the Air Force reports seeing. Then these unidentified flying object sightings morph into the more saucer-shaped objects that we see today. At first, after World War II is over, the US and the USSR aren't sure if these flying discs are technology from either side. And to be more specific, each side didn't even know if more secretive parts of their own government were responsible for the sightings. Like in the example of the FBI's suspicions that these flying discs were a product of the US Army. But once the US government and its various agencies, especially throughout the 1950s, come to their own conclusions about the UFO phenomenon and arrive at satisfying answers, this leaves just handfuls of unexplained events that aren't misidentified objects, actual experiments by the armed forces, or lies or hoaxes. So some committees are set up. Some of those committees are basically psyops from the government to keep things a secret, but some of these committees are in good faith. Narratives swirl that aliens could be here to prevent us from going to nuclear war, and sightings around nuclear testing facilities are high. Although this is a mostly explainable phenomenon. Nuclear detecting equipment, part of Operation Mogul, which were these top secret balloons with microphones attached to detect nuclear explosions, could account for a large majority of these sightings. Alongside the Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, which itself, according to the CIA, was responsible for about 50% of sightings in the 1950s. And although we are left with some cases and sightings that are unexplainable, unexplainable doesn't necessarily mean that it's definitely aliens. In some cases, there's just not enough data to finish an investigation, though there are a few unexplainable cases that are stunning enough. The graph we have here on the screen is the total UFO sightings from 1947 to 1969, and this one is in the FBI section of the files. And here we see a breakdown between total sightings and the sightings that remain unidentified. For example, in 1947, there were 122 total UFO sightings reported, and then 12 remained unidentified after investigations were conducted. And again, usually this means that they just don't have enough information to, recreate aspects of the event or come to a conclusion that's satisfying. We clearly see an uptick by 1952. There's 1,501 total sightings, with 303 that remained unidentified. But as we see in the UFO files, some of the more compelling sightings are actually ones that come from the 2020s. UFO fascination was high during Vietnam and all of the institutional distrust, and it rises again when we start having congressional hearings and government disclosures in the 2020s, which leads us to the current day. So with all that being said, I thought we'd get into a few things for the first episode that has to do with the UFO files. And it's going to largely depend on, obviously, the 25% of them that I actually read. So now here up on the screen, I have page 132 of the second FBI file in this first batch of the UFO files. So it's an office memo for the US government, and it says, references made to the memo to you from the liaison section dated July 21st, 1947, setting forth a request from Colonel Gold Branson of the Intelligence Division of the War Department for the Bureau to conduct investigation to determine the origin of the flying discs. And I wanted to go over this real quick because it really gives you a vantage point into how the FBI thought about the UFO problem right after World War II. Because again, the way that the government viewed the UFO phenomenon in the 1940s was extremely different than basically every decade afterwards. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we were so paranoid of the Soviets, gaining access to a nuclear weapon and then having a bomber, go over our skies, drop one and take out a city. And that all of this would get confusing if people were constantly, having sightings of UFOs in the sky. But by the time the 1950s happen and the Soviets clearly have a nuclear weapon and then even a thermonuclear weapon, the original stance to what these UFOs were changes quite a bit, especially as the intelligence agencies decide for themselves what these things are. So here are the observations that the memo says. It is felt that the situation regarding these flying saucers and flying discs is very similar to the situation which was previously encountered by the Bureau during the past war in handling complaints arising out of the sighting of Japanese balloons. You will recall that at the inception of these complaints, the Bureau conducted considerable investigation and located numerous balloons as a cooperative measure for the Army, and that after considerable work had been done, the Army then informed that these were military weapons and that they would take over the handling of these completely. This they did, and in an extremely short time issued a big press release as to the splendid work of the Army in locating these Japanese balloons. From the information available thus far, it does not appear that these discs should be treated other than those military weapons. Certainly, the Bureau has no way to determine what experiments the Army and Navy are conducting and whether such might be arising out of experiments being conducted by them, nor do we have any way of determining how far the Russians have progressed in certain experiments and whether such might be the results of experiments by the Russian Army. In short, it would certainly appear that this is a military situation and should be handled strictly by military authorities. So we see two things that are apparent in this paragraph. One, that balloons are getting mistaken for shit all the time. And two, that the intelligence agencies were quite willing to let the affairs of the armed forces stay the affairs of the armed forces, though they had their suspicions. And we see this a lot through the FBI portion of the UFO files, where J. Edgar Hoover is telling people that, hey, listen, the UFO phenomenon is not within the jurisdiction of the FBI. I can't answer any questions you have about it. As the date in the UFO file progresses forward, you're going to see a lot more of those kinds of letters. And then we have this 3 pages earlier on page 129 of the second FBI-related file. And it talks about a Colonel Garrett's suspicions that the flying disc phenomenon had to do with the U.S. Army. And it reads the following. Colonel Garrett stated that he based his assumption on the following. He pointed out that when flying objects were reported, seen over Sweden, the high brass of the War Department exerted tremendous pressure on the Air Force's intelligence to conduct research and collect information in an effort to identify these sightings. Colonel Garrett stated that, in contrast to this, we have reported sightings of unknown objects over the United States, and the high brass appeared to be totally unconcerned. He indicated this led him to believe that they knew enough about these objects to express no concern. Colonel Garrett pointed out further that the objects in question have been seen by many individuals who are what he terms trained observers, such as airplane pilots. He indicated also that several of the individuals are reliable members of the community. He stated it is his conclusion that these individuals saw something. He stated the above has led him to come to the conclusion that there were objects seen which somebody in the government knows all about. Mr. Reynolds pointed out to Colonel Garrett that if it is, in fact, experimentations are being conducted by the U.S. government, then it does not appear reasonable to request the FBI to spend money and precious time conducting inquiries with respect to this matter. Colonel Garrett stated that he agrees with Mr. Reynolds in this regard and indicated that it would be extremely embarrassing to the Air Force's intelligence if it is later learned that these flying discs are, in fact, an experiment of the U.S. government. And that's pretty much what we see with the FBI portion of the UFO files. It's a lot of references to these hoaxes, which at first they investigate, but after a period of time fall out of the jurisdiction of the intelligence agencies. And it's just a bunch of references to stuff that UFO researchers have known for quite a long time. One thing that I did see reference to, however, that did make me, get kind of on the edge of my seat was all these references to Nazi UFOs. So as a kid, I heard on the History Channel many times that the Nazis had UFOs. And this always kind of struck me as batshit crazy. I didn't see why, Hitler was predisposed to be talking to the aliens any more than the American side, or why they were better at reverse engineering the flying disc technology. But then we see all these references in the files and, in the world of UFO research to the Horton brothers. Essentially, we have something called the Horton bomber that was put into production in Nazi Germany in 1944, and it was actually, as the tides were turning against the Nazis, it was one of the last hopes that they held out for. These Horton bombers, as I'll put a picture up on the screen, they look like these, flying disc-shaped objects, and they're supposed to be especially good at evading detection as they came in, swooped down and essentially leveled cities with bombs. According to the version of history that we know now, only 3 of these Horton bombers were ever produced by Nazi Germany. But what we do see in the UFO files are references to this claim that the Nazis put 1,800 of these Horton bombers into production before they were defeated. And so right as the Second World War is ending and we start seeing all these sightings of flying discs, many in the intelligence community of the United States thought that the Russians could have taken the 1,800 that were quote-unquote produced and had essentially started flying them over United States airspace. But as the story goes, these 1,800 were never actually put into production. It was more so like a hope and dream of the Nazis at that point, something that was on paper but hadn't manifested yet. And the United States was never successful in taking the design of the Horton bomber and actually creating its own bomber out of it in mass. So now I'm going to read from this letter that was drafted by the FBI. It has to do with this interview that they conducted with this European prisoner of war that was caught by Nazi Germany in 1942. News reports of mysterious vehicle in Texas causing engines to stall prompted him to communicate with the United States government concerning a similar phenomenon observed by him in 1944 in the area of Gut Alt Golsen. According to Krasuski, who was the prisoner of war, during 1944, month not recalled, while en route to work in a field a short distance north of Gut Alt Golsen, their tractor engine stalled on a road through a swamp area. No machinery or other vehicle was then visible, although a noise was heard described as a high-pitched whine similar to that produced by a large electric generator. An SS guard appeared and talked briefly with the German driver of the tractor, who waited 5 to 10 minutes, after which the noise stopped and the tractor engine was started normally. Approximately 3 hours later, in the same swamp area, but away from the road where the crew work was cutting hay, he surreptitiously, because of the German in charge of the crew and SS guards in the otherwise deserted area, observed a circular enclosure approximately 100 to 150 yards in diameter, protected from viewers by a tarpaulin-type wall approximately 50 feet high, from which a vehicle was observed to slowly rise vertically to a height sufficient to clear the wall and then to move slowly horizontally a short distance out of his view, which was obstructed by nearby trees. This vehicle, observed from approximately 500 feet, was described as circular in shape, 75 to 100 yards in diameter, and about 14 feet high, consisting of dark gray stationary top and bottom sections 5 to 6 feet high. The approximate 3-foot middle section appeared to be a rapidly moving component producing a continuous blur similar to an aeroplane propeller, but extending the circumference of the vehicle so far as could be observed. The noise emanating from the vehicle was similar, but of somewhat lower pitch than the noise previously heard. The engine of the tractor again stalled on this occasion, and no effort was made by the German driver to start the engine until the noise stopped, after which the engine started normally. Uninsulated metal, possibly copper, cables 1.5 inch to 2 inches in diameter, on and under the surface of the ground, in some places covered by water, were observed on this and previous occasions, apparently running between the enclosure and a small concrete column-like structure between the road and enclosure. So what we see from this interview between the FBI and Krasuski is the idea that these Nazi UFOs, or the Horton bombers, which we see a description of in that letter, they basically shut down all electronics. So not only do we get more references to, potential 1800 Horton bombers that were put in production in these UFO files, but we also get this FBI interview that describes it. And these discs are quite clearly turning electronics off. So I wanted to also relate that to an interview the FBI conducted in September of 2023, which was about another sighting that occurred. The 3 vehicles came to a gate that was giving Redacted trouble. At about 3/4 of the windshield up, Redacted saw a linear object with a super bright light on the east side of the object. The light was bright white and bright enough to see bands within the light. The object was metallic/gray in color. It did not have any wings or exhaust. The object was smaller than a 737, 1 to 2 Black Hawk helicopters in length, and was definitely bigger than a drone. The object was approximately 5,000 feet above ground level and moved east to west parallel to the ground. The object was visible for 5 to 10 seconds, and then the light went out and the object vanished. The sky was clear and Redacted couldn't find the object again. The object stayed the same size and kept the same light intensity during the time Redacted observed it. He did not see the object as they were coming over the small bridge of the gate until they were going through the gate. Redacted did not notice any interference with their vehicles. Redacted was annoyed when she first saw the object because the airspace had been restricted for the drone tests they were going to conduct. Redacted in the second vehicle tried to get Redacted to see the object but was unsuccessful. And here's the part that's extremely interesting. Redacted that night, a storm came through and the TV went out in Redacted's hotel room. He was still freaked out and went downstairs to make sure all the TVs were out in the hotel and not just his. Redacted had weird dreams and had trouble sleeping for the first 2 nights after he saw the object. So not only does it seem like the person during the sighting knew that there was a connection between the UFO sighting and the electronic interference, but they had enough sense to go check if all the other electronics in the hotel were out as well. So if UFOs have reportedly been messing with electronic equipment for over 8 decades, is it possible that this technology could have come from the Nazi Horton bombers, which our government maybe tested in U.S. airspace over these last 8 decades? And this is something that I was kind of thinking of when I was going through the files, especially in this era of Epstein disclosure and the absolute psychopathic nature of our elite class. What if the U.S. government did have a few of these Horton bombers, and there really were only a few that existed? What if they kept a few of these Horton bombers around in secret because the government knew what they represented in our minds and flew them around once in a while to fascinate the public every time they needed a distraction? And then we have this quite eerie NASA file about Apollo 12. The following is from one of the astronauts on the Apollo 12 mission. They say, "Roger, when you look out the AOT in the dark quadrant, you can see these lights, particles of light, flashes of light that just seem to come from," in this case, I'm looking in quadrant 1, which is the left one. "It's coming from behind me, the left, and they're just sailing off into space. I was thinking they're dropping from my water boiler, but it looks like some of those things are escaping the moon. They really haul out of here and just press off at the stars. And then later, that same person says, got sort of an interesting thing going on AGS right now. I didn't notice earlier, but it may just be because the lights are brighter now. I'm getting an all eights flash on both the address and the information registers at about 1/5 the brilliance of the normal numbers, and it's pulsing every second. And this is when the Apollo 12 astronauts are on the moon already, which reminds me of another fact that I came across in researching this topic, which is that NASA actually didn't have 100% confidence that when the astronauts went on their first mission to the moon, that there wouldn't already be aliens there. And so for the astronauts that were on this Apollo 12 mission, talking about these blinking, pulsating lights and, these things that looked like vehicles that were zooming away from the moon, that must have been an extremely frightening experience. And more credit to these astronauts for not absolutely losing their shit at that moment, although I suppose when you're on the moon, that's not really an option. The Apollo 17 sightings feel even more scarier if you want to look those up in the UFO files for yourself. And even on Apollo 11, which was that flagship vessel to the moon that, was carrying Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, there were these particles of light that kept entering and exiting the ship that Aldrin and Armstrong talked about in the debriefing after the entire mission. And so it basically seems like there's something fishy going on during every one of our missions to the moon. It's quite interesting to go over the transcripts for these Apollo missions when they're seeing these objects, but as we see on the screen right now, I'm kind of going through some of these very blurry images that we see taken from that vantage point on the moon. So overall, no, there's really not any smoking gun in the UFO files, at least as researchers have seen so far, and at least in the 25% that I've personally seen. But a lot of it does sort of confirm the UFO timeline that a lot of researchers have put forward in their, painstaking research and interviews.